The clang of oars against the hull, the smell of tar and blood. 500 ships stretched along the coast of England like black claws, dug into the land of Albion. Chronicles of that time say, never before had the Angles seen such a vast army. 500 longships, not a myth, not a legend. This was the great heathen army, which came not to plunder, but to conquer. Why then, in the year 866, did the sea bring the Viking empires here, to these cold shores? And what forced these people to leave the north, where the earth itself rings with cold, for a foreign land where every mile smells of death? Historians write that it all began after the death of Ragnar Lodbrok, a legendary konung, whom the Anglo-Saxon king Allah threw into a pit of snakes. This act became the spark that ignited the bonfire of war. His sons, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba, swore to take revenge. It was their oath that began the campaign, which chroniclers called Mysilhere, the Great Army. At that time, the term drakkar denoted a long and narrow vessel with high sides, adorned with a carved dragon's head. These ships could move both on the sea and on rivers, like living beasts capable of gripping any land. The wooden monsters carried 30 to 40 warriors each. The weight of one fighter's equipment was up to 30 kilograms: chainmail, shield, sword, axe, provisions. Their campaign was not a raid. It was a migration of force, an invasion by an entire people. Archaeological excavations in Repton and York confirm. Scandinavian burials with weapons, silver, and Thor's amulets were found here. The land is literally saturated with northern history, and if you listen closely, you can hear how the ancient drum of their march beats beneath the earth. England at that moment was fragmented. 4 kingdoms, Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex, lived in constant strife. And it was this fragmentation that became an invitation. As a pack of wolves smells blood, so the Vikings smelled power. They knew if one strikes quickly and coordinatedly, the old order can be crushed. Thus began a campaign which had no equal in scale. But behind this army stood not only the desire for revenge, this was an attempt to create a new world. A Scandinavian empire on English soil. The Vikings called it Danelaw, law of the Danes. That is, a territory where their customs, their truth, their swords held sway. When their fleet appeared off the coast of East Anglia, fog enveloped the sea, and on the shore, they say, even the birds fell silent. Hundreds of sails, black from tar, rose above the horizon, like a flock of ravens. This image forever entered the consciousness of the Angles as a symbol of the end of the old world. But who stood at the head of this army? How did they manage such a mass of people who came from dozens of different tribes and lands? And most importantly, what was happening inside these camps, where languages, oaths, and the smells of war mingled? The ashes of the bonfires had not yet cooled, and over the coast of East Anglia, the banners of the Vikings were already rising. Chronicles describe, in the autumn of 866, the sea spat out onto the shore not just an army, but an entire nation of warriors. Hundreds of ships stood in a line, each like a fortress of wood and iron. A stormy wind unfurled the striped sails, and it seemed that nature itself bowed before this invasion. But how was such a force assembled, if the north was then divided by dozens of small kingdoms? The answer is hidden in a concept that in Old Norse sounded like feathing, an alliance of chieftains for a common campaign. A feathing was more than a treaty. It was an oath sealed with blood. Each konung brought under the banners of Ivar and Halfdan not just warriors, but also the faith and honor of his clan. On the plains of Denmark and the shores of Norway, blacksmiths worked without sleep, forging swords, shields, and axes. One ship was built in 3 months. Oak planks, fastened with iron rivets, were covered with tar to survive the storm. Archaeologists found in the remains of shipyards near Roskilde traces of workshops where dozens of longships could be built simultaneously. The scale was colossal, as if today tens of thousands of soldiers from different armies united for one campaign. Inside the camps, life was bustling. Hundreds of bonfires, the smell of smoked meat, the clang of hammers, and the chanting of skalds. Here, beneath the rumble of drums, destinies were decided. Every warrior knew ahead was not just a battle, but a trial that would forever engrave his name in the sagas. Axes were sharpened to a mirror shine, runes were carved onto spear shafts. The Vikings believed that these symbols imparted strength in battle. The term describing such a military camp sounded like vik, a temporary fortification by the water. From this word later came the very word, Viking. A vik was not just a resting place, it was a ritual space where a northerner prepared to die with dignity. A circle of shields, tents made of sails, watchtowers of wood. Everything was ordered, like ants, only instead of sand, bones, and iron. Historians note that by the time of departure from Scandinavia, the army could number up to 20,000 people. For that time, an inconceivable number. They did not march blindly. Scouts had landed in England beforehand, studying fords, roads, and the locations of monasteries. These scouts were called scuti, people moving ahead like shadows. Their task was to find a weak point, and they found it. East Anglia was poorly defended. Its king, Edmund, had neither a powerful army nor allies. When the first detachment landed at the mouth of the River Yar, the Anglo-Saxons did not believe the reality of what was happening. They came like a storm, and the earth trembled at the sound of their shields, is recorded in the Chronicle. This was not merely an attack. It was a demonstration of force. Dozens of ships formed a semicircle near the shore, like the jaws of a beast. On the masts were wolf heads, on the shields, skulls of enemies from previous campaigns. Everything around screamed of the impending terror. But the Vikings had a purpose far deeper than plunder. They carried with them the idea of a new order, a world where their law, their language, and their gods could live alongside the conquered peoples. It was during these days that the idea of establishing permanent settlements was born. Archaeological findings in Ravensworth and York confirm. Soon after the landing, the first Scandinavian-type houses appeared, long, elongated, with a hearth in the middle. Yet, discipline in the camp was maintained by fear and personal loyalty. Warriors were divided into tens, led by experienced fighters who were called drengs. This word meant men of honor, the elite of the army. To be a dreng meant to go into the front line, where arrows flew. They formed the backbone upon which the army rested. At night, the camp plunged into silence. Only the sea whispered of the great campaign ahead, in which blood, faith, and destiny would merge. Ivar the Boneless, sitting by the fire, drew a map in the sand with a stick. No one knew that his mind was colder than the northern wind. He could not walk, but he commanded the army like a chess player commands the board. His weakness became strength, and his name, fear for all of England. And when the first rays of the sun illuminated the sea, hundreds of ships weighed anchor. At that moment, they say, the air hummed with the cries of thousands of warriors. Their sails filled with wind, and the shadow of the great heathen army fell upon the shores of Albion. And with this shadow, there could be no negotiation. It brought not merely war, it brought the end of an era. The fog over the river Humber dispersed slowly, like the breath of a beast. From it emerged the dark silhouettes of ships, and soon a dull hum was heard over the water, the sound of hundreds of horns, announcing the beginning of the invasion. Chronicles report in the autumn of 866, Ivar the Boneless's army moved north towards the lands of Northumbria. This campaign became the first blow of the great heathen army to the heart of Anglo-Saxon England. Northumbria was fragmented. A struggle for power was ongoing between its kings, Aelle and Osbert. Ivar understood the enemy could be crushed while he fought against himself. The Vikings marched along the river across swamps and hills, leaving burned villages in their wake. Every step of their army was planned. The tactic they employed was called the swine, a dense, wedge-shaped formation aimed directly at the enemy's heart. Ahead marched the best, the Drengs. Behind them, the warriors of the second rank and spearmen closed the formation. This living wedge broke through defenses like an iron tusk. Contemporaries wrote that to witness a swine attack was like watching the sea crash upon the land. At dawn, they approached York, an ancient city then called Eoforwic. Its wooden walls, hastily erected, could not stop the onslaught of 500 ships full of warriors. Chronicles recount, on the day of the battle, the sky was gray, the wind from the sea drove the rain, and the Vikings' shields gleamed like snake scales. Signal fires burned on the towers, but no help came. Ella and Osbert, forgetting their enmity, hastened to unite their forces. Too late. Ivar stood on a cart at the edge of the hill, giving orders. He did not move, but his voice was like steel. He commanded coolly, calculatingly, as if playing a game of gods. Later chroniclers would write, "He knew no fear, for his bones were already dead." His nickname, the Boneless, became a symbol of inhuman will. Perhaps he suffered from an illness that made his body weak, but his mind ruthless. The assault lasted several hours. The Vikings breached the gates, stormed into the city, and unleashed fire upon it. Chronicles assert that York fell in November of 867. Ella and Osbert perished. Ivar ordered their bodies to be buried according to the custom of the Northerners, without honors, as spoils. Thus he avenged Ragnar. But the most gruesome tradition states the blood eagle was performed on Allah, an ancient sacrificial ritual where the enemy's back was cut open, exposing the ribs like wings. Historians dispute whether this ritual was real or merely a symbolic act, but the very idea instilled terror in all who heard of it. Ivar's army did not remain in York. They fortified the city, turning it into a base. Archaeologists found traces of ancient fortifications, a moat, walls, remnants of smithies and warehouses. This was the first major center of Viking power on British soil. The city received a new name, Jorvik. Here, for the first time, the Northern law, Danelaw, began to operate, where justice was administered according to Danish customs. The term Danelaw signified a zone where Viking law, distinct from Anglo-Saxon law, held sway. Here, the judge was called a lagman, literally lawman. He resolved disputes by memory, without written codes, relying on the oath of witnesses. This revealed a peculiar characteristic of Northern society, a belief in the word given in public. And now, this word became law in a foreign land. After the fall of York, the army divided. One part remained to hold the north, the other moved further south, to the lands of Mercia. In the spring of 868, they set out again, this time under the command of the brothers Halfdan and Guthrum. Historians note that the discipline in this army astonished contemporaries. Each detachment had its own sign, its own horn, its own signals. When the army gathered, there was such a roar as if the earth itself sang a battle song. The Anglo-Saxons tried to resist, but their armies were small and fragmented. Only one kingdom, Wessex, retained internal strength. Its king, the young Alfred, did not yet know that he would soon become the last wall between England and the Northern Sea. Jorvik transformed into the capital of the new power. A mixture of languages echoed in its streets: Scandinavian, Latin, Old English. Merchants sold furs, swords, amber, and slaves. The great heathen army, which began as a punitive expedition, gradually transformed into the foundation of a new state. But within it, discord was already beginning to ripen. Ivar vanished from the chronicles, like a shadow dissolving in the fog, leaving his brothers with power and burden. From the north, the Vikings brought not only swords, they brought order, built on fear and honor. But this order was fragile. With each new campaign, the army moved further from the sea, losing connection with its homeland and gods. And where the roar of victory once sounded, a new force was soon to emerge. The strength of those who decided that the land could be defended not by blood, but by will. The year 871 entered the chronicles as the year of 9 battles. The land of Wessex groaned under the blows of the Northerners. The great heathen army moved like an avalanche, town after town, monastery after monastery. Chronicles write, they came like a winter storm and knew no weariness. But, for the first time, they were opposed by a man of equal resolve, Alfred, the younger brother of the deceased King Ethelred. He was no older than 30, but already understood, if Wessex fell, all of England would fall. By that point, the Viking army numbered by various estimates up to 25,000 men. Their camp near Reading was larger than any city in the south. Life was bustling here. Swords were forged, ships were repaired, spoils were divided. But along with wealth came weariness. The army, accustomed to victory, encountered an enemy who did not engage in open battle, but struck from the fog, retreated, lured into swamps. This tactic, which would later be called War of Attrition, Alfred employed with cold calculation. He knew that the Vikings depended on their supply bases, on farms and livestock, which they took from the conquered. Therefore, he burned villages, leaving empty lands behind him. This was a struggle not for territory, but for time to gather strength. Alfred created a system of burhs, fortified settlements connected by roads. A burh was not just a fortress, but a stronghold of survival. In each burh there was grain, water, and weapons, and each could withstand a siege. The Vikings for the first time encountered an opponent who knew how to count, to wait, and not to lose faith. They won battles, but not the war. In January of 871, the first clash occurred near Reading. The Northerners repelled Alfred's attack, but soon he struck back at Ashdown. The battle lasted all day, and chronicles describe it as a fight where the earth turned into a sea of mud and blood. Shields broke, swords bent, but the angles stood. On that day, Alfred showed that the enemy was mortal. The term used to describe the Wessex formation was shield wall, a dense line of warriors where each shield covered the shoulder of a neighbor. This was a living bastion. The Vikings respected this formation. It demanded not strength, but unity. When the shield wall withstood the onslaught of the swine, man-to-man combat began, where will, not weapons, decided the outcome. Archaeologists found arrowheads and axe fragments in the Ashdown area, evidence that the battle was desperate. Alfred retreated and regrouped again, like the breath of the forest. The Vikings, however, began to lose their internal cohesion. After Ivar's death, Guthrum took his place, a practical warrior, but lacking his brother's charisma. He preferred negotiations if they led to advantage, but the army, hardened in blood, did not know how to live without battle. Every chieftain wanted glory, gold, lands. The alliance, cemented by vengeance, now rested on greed. In the spring of 873, Guthrum once again led his troops against Alfred. They besieged Chippenham, the king's winter court. The attack was sudden. According to chronicles, the Northerners attacked on the night of January 12th, when the Anglo-Saxons were celebrating Epiphany. Everything burned. Alfred, with a small retinue, fled into the swamps of Somerset. Thus began his legend. Mud, cold, hunger, these were his allies. The king, now in exile, gathered the remnants of his army, hiding among the swamps. Later, chroniclers would write, he fed on fish and hope. Meanwhile, the great army celebrated victory. They thought England was finally broken. But it was in the swamps that a new order was born. Alfred created a militia of peasants and warriors, hardened by suffering. He taught them to strike suddenly, to disappear before dawn. His camp became a living entity, rising from the fog when the Northerners least expected it. Archaeologists found remains of camps from that time in Somerset, food storage pits, spearheads, remnants of boats. Everything indicates that this army from the swamps truly existed. Historians call this period the transition from survival to revival. Alfred turned defeat into a weapon. By the summer of 872, Guthrum began to feel the pressure. His army was dispersed, supplies dwindled, and local residents rose up in resistance. The Vikings, for the first time, faced an enemy who did not surrender after defeat. They could destroy cities, but they could not destroy the spirit. The great heathen army, once invincible, now became a heavy burden for its own chieftains. It belonged to no one, too large to manage and too fragmented to be a unified blade. And over this army, the question was increasingly asked: had the gods truly turned away? Because where recently the roar of victories sounded, now only the breath of the swamps and the clang of steel, heralding a new morning, could be heard. In the spring of 878, the swamps of Somerset filled with smoke. Alfred the Great, having gathered around him the remnants of his army and a militia of peasants, prepared to strike a blow that would change the course of history. For 7 years, the great heathen army had dominated England, and now the time for reckoning had come. The Northerners, confident in their victory, had stretched their forces across the country, leaving large garrisons in York, London, Gloucester, and Chippenham. But it was this very confidence that became their undoing. Chronicles recount that in the spring, Alfred assembled his army at Egbert's Stone, a place where, according to tradition, every man swore not to retreat. He then led no more than 5,000 men onto the field, but these were people hardened by deprivation. Against them stood up to 15,000 of Guthrum's warriors, experienced, well-armed, and self-assured. The Vikings laughed when they heard that the exiled king was coming against them with a peasant army, but within a few weeks they had no more reason to laugh. The decisive battle took place at Edington. The exact location is not established, but archaeologists have found spearheads and charred shield fragments in those areas, traces of a great battle. On the eve of the battle, Alfred ordered his men to fortify their positions and build a shield wall. 3 rows of shields, each like a stone in dense masonry. The Vikings formed their swine, a wedge-shaped formation with which they had won dozens of battles. In the morning, fog lay over the field, and in its gray shroud 2 worlds collided. Witnesses wrote that the battle lasted all day. The Vikings struck with shields, breaking through ranks, but the Anglo-Saxons stood like oak roots. Then Alfred gave a signal, and the first line opened. Through the gap, the spearmen struck. This was the turning point. They wavered, wrote the chronicler, and for the first time in 7 years the eyes of the Northerners saw fear. When the sun dipped to the west, the great army was defeated. Guthrum and his warriors retreated to a fortified camp, but capitulated the next morning. The term describing this moment in the Chronicles sounds like grinding. This word conveyed the essence of the battle. 2 worlds, compressed into one vortex, ground each other until only silence remained. Alfred displayed what the Vikings called drengskaper, the mercy of a victor. He did not destroy the captives, but offered Guthrum a choice: to be baptized and remain to rule the eastern lands under the English crown. Guthrum agreed. He was baptized under the name Athelstan, and soon a treaty known as the Peace of Wedmore was concluded. This peace became not just a truce, but a new order. Under the terms of the treaty, England was divided. The west remained with Alfred, the east with the Danes. Thus, the border known as the Danelong Line was born. Everything northeast of the Thames became Scandinavian territory. This was an acknowledgement that the great heathen army had not conquered England, but had changed it forever. Archaeological findings confirm, after the treaty, the Northerners began to settle the lands peacefully. In excavations of York and Nottingham, Thor's amulets were found alongside crosses, Scandinavian swords alongside Anglo-Saxon buckles. Two worlds, long standing on opposite sides of the sword, began to merge. Historians call this the beginning of a dual culture, a blending of customs, language, and architecture. But not everyone accepted the peace. Some warriors, especially young jarls, believed that Guthrum had betrayed the gods. They left England, heading to Ireland and France. There, the great heathen army finally dispersed. Some settled in Dublin, founding the first Scandinavian kingdom of Ireland. Another part perished in endless skirmishes. Thus the army, once unified, dissolved like fog over the sea. The term that best describes this disintegration is sig, fate. For the northerner, fate was not a punishment. It was a path that could not be turned from. The great heathen army followed its path to the end. It brought destruction, but also a new era. After Wedmore, reconstruction began. Cities were fortified, trade revived, monasteries were reborn. England rose from the ruins anew. No longer purely Anglo-Saxon, but Anglo-Scandinavian. When the chronicles wrote that the Vikings disappeared from the shores of Wessex, it was not a disappearance, but a transformation. Those who came with the sword remained with the plow. Their descendants lived here for centuries. Their words entered the language, their laws into legal traditions. But the memory of the great heathen army lived longer than its swords. And when fog rises at night on the shores of England, the old people said they hear horns sounding far out at sea, an echo of that morning when 500 ships first appeared on the horizon. They say that the sea remembers everything, and when the waves crash against the cliffs of York, they whisper the names of those who came here under black sails. The great heathen army did not disappear. It dissolved into England itself. From its ashes a new people was born, where the blood of the northerners mingled with the blood of the Angles. Their swords turned into furrows, their ships into homes, their gods into legends. Historians believe that it was after those years that England first realized itself as a unified land. Alfred the Great created a system of laws, drawing upon the memory of his enemies. He adopted from the Vikings discipline, organization, and a system of fortifications. Even the word fleet entered Anglo-Saxon speech from the language of those who were once feared. Archaeological findings, Scandinavian jewelry in English graves, runic symbols on crosses confirm that the boundaries between peoples blurred. But the main trace remained not in the earth, but in human memory. The great heathen army became a lesson. Strength does not reside in destruction. It resides in the ability to rise after it. Their swords rust, but their resolve still troubles the sea. And now, when you hear the sound of the surf, ask yourself, if 500 ships were to appear on the horizon again, would you find within yourself as much will as there was in those who walked to their death for the sake of their fate?